There is a woman who died over 70 years ago, yet she is arguably more alive today than you or me. Her cells are currently living in laboratories in nearly every country on the face of the earth. If you have ever taken a polio vaccine, or received treatment for cancer, or even gotten a shot for COVID-19, you have this woman to thank for your survival. But here is the dark twist that most people miss. While her biological material has saved billions of lives and generated billions of dollars in profit, she never agreed to donate a single piece of herself. In fact, for decades, her own family didn't know that parts of her body were being bought and sold like car parts in a global marketplace. This is not just a story about a medical miracle. It is a story about theft on a microscopic scale that changed the course of human history forever. And the most shocking part? The legal battle over who actually owns these cells is still happening in courtrooms right now in 2025.
To truly understand the scale of this phenomenon, you have to visualize something almost impossible. Scientists estimate that if you gathered every single cell ever grown from this one woman, the total weight would exceed 50 million metric tons. That is roughly the weight of 100 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. If you took those microscopic cells and laid them end to end, they would wrap around the planet at least 3 times. It sounds like the plot of a science fiction horror movie, a biological entity that just keeps growing and growing, consuming nutrients and doubling in size every 24 hours. But this is not fiction. These are known as HeLa cells, and they are the workhorse of modern biology. For the last 70 years, they have been exposed to nuclear radiation, sent into deep space on rockets, and infected with everything from tuberculosis to HIV. They are quite literally the most tested material in the history of science. But for a long time, the world forgot that these cells didn't just appear out of thin air. They came from a real human being who had a name, a family, and a life. And that life was cut short in a way that raises uncomfortable questions about medical ethics.
Her name was Henrietta Lacks. She was a poor tobacco farmer from Southern Virginia who loved to cook and dance. In 1951, she was a 31-year-old mother of 5 living in a time of deep racial segregation. When she felt a strange knot inside her womb, she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. At the time, it was one of the few top hospitals that would treat African American patients. Doctors discovered a particularly aggressive tumor on her cervix and began radiation treatments. But during her procedure, a surgeon did something that was standard practice back then, but would be illegal today. Without asking her permission or even telling her, he sliced off a small sample of her tumor and sent it down the hall to a lab. Henrietta went home in pain, and tragically, she died just a few months later, in October of 1951. She was buried in an unmarked grave, her family believing that was the end of her story. They had no idea that a piece of her was still alive and about to take over the world. Down the hall in that laboratory, a researcher named Dr. George Guy had been trying for years to keep human cells alive outside the body. He had failed every single time. Usually, human cells in a petri dish would divide a few times and then simply die off within a few days. But Henrietta's cells were different.
What happened next baffled the scientific community. Instead of dying like every other sample, Henrietta's cells began to eat and divide with terrifying speed. They doubled their numbers every 20 to 24 hours. They didn't just survive, they thrived, taking over any space they were given. In biology, there's a concept called the Hayflick limit. It states that normal human cells can only divide about 40 to 60 times before they become exhausted and die. It is a natural safety mechanism against aging and cancer.
But Henrietta's cells completely ignored this rule. Research revealed that her cells had been mutated by a specific type of virus, HPV-18, which essentially cut the brakes on her cellular division. They also had hyperactive telomerase, an enzyme that rebuilds the protective caps on DNA, making the cells effectively immortal. Dr. Guy realized he had struck scientific gold. He named the cell line HeLa by combining the first two letters of her first and last name. He began shipping vials of these immortal cells to colleagues around the world. Suddenly, scientists in London, Tokyo, and New York had a standardized human test subject that never complained and never died. It launched a golden age of medical discovery. But while the world celebrated these breakthroughs, Henrietta's husband and children were living in poverty, completely unaware that their mother's cells were becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry.
The impact of HeLa cells is hard to overstate. In the early 1950s, polio was paralyzing children all across America and the world. Jonas Salk needed a way to test his vaccine on a massive scale without risking human lives. HeLa cells provided the perfect solution. A factory was built at Tuskegee University to produce trillions of these cells every week, proving the vaccine was safe and effective. This single application saved countless lives. Later, these cells were used to map the human genome, develop chemotherapy drugs, and even study the effects of zero gravity for NASA. More recently, during the global pandemic, HeLa cells were used to study how COVID-19 infects the body, accelerating the development of vaccines. But there is a bitter irony here. The Lax family, whose mother made this possible, couldn't afford health insurance for themselves. For more than 20 years, they didn't even know the cells existed. It wasn't until the 1970s that researchers started calling the family, asking for blood samples. The family was confused and terrified. They thought the doctors were testing them for cancer, but the scientists were actually just trying to map the genetics of the HeLa cells to separate them from other lines. The communication gap was heartbreaking. You had scientists viewing the family as data points, and a family wondering if their mother was being cloned or if she was feeling pain in a lab somewhere. It revealed a massive disconnect between scientific progress and basic human dignity.
For decades, the standard legal defense was simple. Courts ruled that once tissue leaves your body, you no longer have any property rights to it. This meant pharmaceutical companies could patent discoveries made with HeLa cells and keep 100% of the profits. The Lax family watched as companies made billions while they struggled to pay their own medical bills. But recently, the tide has started to turn. In a landmark shift, the family finally decided to sue, not for medical malpractice, but for unjust enrichment. The argument was that companies were still profiting from stolen property every single day. And guess what? It started working. In August 2023, the estate reached a historic settlement with Thermo Fisher Scientific, one of the largest biotech companies in the world. While the amount remains confidential, it was the first time a company effectively paid restitution for the unauthorized use of Henrietta's cells. But the battle didn't stop there. As of March 2025, the family is actively litigating against other pharmaceutical giants like Ultragenyx and Novartis. They are challenging the very foundation of how biological research is monetized. The courts are now having to decide if the statute of limitations applies when the stolen goods are still replicating and generating new profits every single day.
So where does this leave us today? It forces us to look at the uncomfortable reality that modern medicine was built on a foundation of inequality. Henrietta Lacks was a black woman in the Jim Crow South who was treated as a specimen rather than a patient, yet without her, many of us wouldn't be alive. There is a statue of her now in Roanoke, Virginia,
standing where a monument to Robert E. Lee once stood. It is a powerful symbol of how history is being rewritten to acknowledge the hidden figures behind our progress. But statues don't pay the bills, and they don't fix the ethical breach of trust. The story of HeLa cells is a reminder that science doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens to real people. Every time a researcher uncorks a vial of HeLa cells, they are working with the ghost of a woman who never got to see her children grow up.
We often think of immortality as a blessing, something billionaires try to buy with technology. But for Henrietta Lacks, immortality was something that was taken, not given. Her cells have traveled further than she ever dreamed, reaching the moon and back and residing in freezers on every continent. She has achieved a status that no emperor or king could ever claim. But the question we have to ask ourselves is simple. Is the advancement of the human race worth the price of losing our right to our own bodies? As we move into an era of genetic engineering and AI, that question is going to become more relevant than ever. Henrietta's story isn't just history, it is a warning for the future. Because in the end, if we don't own our own biology, what do we actually own?